Hello everyone and welcome. In this video we're going to be talking about gasoline versus diesel engines and four major differences between them. So in front of me I have a single cylinder 4-stroke gasoline engine, and this will be very helpful in demonstrating how these engines work differently. So the first thing we're going to talk about is perhaps one of the biggest differences, and that's how they ignite the air-fuel mixture. So with a gasoline engine, you use a spark plug to ignite that air-fuel mixture, and with a diesel engine you use compression. Now, something you need to understand is called the self-ignition temperature. And this is the temperature for which an air-fuel mixture will combust simply based on the heat without the use of a spark plug. And so if you bring an air-fuel mixture up to this temperature, simply through doing it through compression, that air-fuel mixture is going to ignite, and you don't need an external source to ignite it. So the important thing to do with a gasoline engine is to make sure that when you're compressing that air-fuel mixture during your compression stroke, you don't compress it so much that you exceed that self-ignition temperature, and then because of that, you're going to have ignition occur before you want it to, before the spark plug ignites it. Now with a diesel engine, on the other hand, you want to do this differently. So you want to make sure that as you compress that air-fuel mixture, you go beyond that self-ignition temperature so that when you do inject the fuel in after you've compressed the air, it's at a temperature high enough so that as soon as that fuel gets injected in, you can ignite that fuel and then you have combustion occur. So both of them use the same essential 4 strokes. You've got your intake, you've got your compression, where you compress that air or air-fuel mixture. You have your fuel shot in with the diesel engine at that point, and instead of that spark plug, you're going to have a fuel injector, and then in the gasoline engine, you have the spark igniting that air-fuel mixture, so you have your power stroke, and then you press that air and fuel out after it's combusted, so you press out the exhaust gases. So because of that self-ignition temperature, and you want to make sure that diesels go above it and that gasoline stay below it, this is why you have a major difference in compression ratios between gasoline and diesel engines. So gasoline engines will typically have much lower compression ratios, somewhere around 10 to 1, versus diesel engines can be much higher, 16 to 1, even higher than that. And so that's the biggest difference, is you want to make sure that you get that air hot enough so that when you spray that fuel in, that diesel fuel, it ignites it. Getting into number 2, throttle versus no throttle. Typically in a diesel engine, you're not going to have a throttle body with this butterfly valve within, versus in a gasoline engine, you're always going to have this throttle valve. And so the reason you have this in a gasoline engine, this is how you manipulate how much power you're making. So when you press on the accelerator pedal, what you're doing is you're opening up this butterfly valve. So the more you open it, the more air goes into the engine. The more air that you have going into the engine, the more fuel is injected, and then you make more power. In a diesel, on the other hand, what you're doing is actually manipulating the amount of fuel that gets injected in. So there's no throttle, you just have a pure opening. Nothing blocking it, and so you've always got a good amount of air coming in, but what you differ is how much fuel you inject. So as you inject more fuel, you make more power, that creates more exhaust, that spools up your turbo more, and you pull in more air, more fuel, and you continue to grow more power. Now, some modern diesels will actually have throttle valves in the intake, and what that allows you to do is manipulate the pressure within the intake manifold. And so by doing that, you can increase the amount of exhaust gas recirculation. Now, the other thing that you may do it for to have a throttle valve in a diesel engine is that when you shut the engine off, you can start to close that valve slowly, and so as that engine shuts off, it's not a really abrupt, harsh thing because you're starting to limit the amount of air that goes into it, and so you have a smoother shutdown. Moving on to number 3, we're going to talk about air-fuel ratios, and this part helps explain why diesel engines are capable of creating more power simply by injecting more fuel. And so one of the interesting things about gasoline and diesel engines is that they have very similar stoichiometric air-fuel ratios. So this is the ratio at which all the oxygen and all the fuel is going to be burned, and that's somewhere around 14.5 to 15 to 1, depending on the hydrocarbon mixture of that fuel. If you're curious about where that number comes from, I have a separate video explaining the math behind it, which you're welcome to check out. I'll have a link in the video description. So the interesting thing about this is, and here we just have a chart of air-fuel ratios from 1:1 to 75:1. The interesting thing is that although they have the same stoichiometric ratio, they operate in vastly different ranges. And so a gasoline engine, combustion can occur from an air-fuel ratio of about 6:1 to about 25:1, but typically engines are going to operate somewhere in the 12 to 18:1 ratio range. A diesel engine, on the other hand, operates on a much larger scale, from about 18:1 to about 70:1. So anything above stoichiometric is going to be lean, anything below is going to be considered rich. And so as you can see, diesels are typically going to operate in this lean range. And what you do is you simply inject more fuel, and that brings your air-fuel mixture down, and you create more power, and that's bringing you down this scale for the air-fuel mixture. So how is it possible for diesel engines to operate across such a large range of air-fuel mixtures? Well, the important thing to realize is that in a diesel engine, when you have direct injection and that diesel fuel is injected in, you're going to have pockets of fuel which are combustible because they're within a combustible range, and then you're going to have pockets which are either too lean or too rich. And so while your air-fuel ratio overall may be 65:1, some of those pockets are going to be at much lower ratios. And so they're going to be able to combust. Some are going to be too lean, some are going to be too rich. Those won't combust, and so it'll have to wait until those, get to the proper ratio for them to combust. So your overall ratio may be out here, but you'll have some pockets which are low enough which they can combust, and so you will have combustion occur in that diesel engine. All right, so moving into our final point, we're going to be talking about engine braking. So in a gasoline engine, the way engine braking works is that when you let off the gas pedal, this throttle valve closes, and so because that throttle valve is closed, whenever you're going on your intake stroke and this piston is moving down and it's trying to pull in air, this throttle valve is creating a block, so you're creating a vacuum in here, and that vacuum is what's going to be slowing your vehicle down. So it's going to be slowing your engine down to do that. Your engine is connected to your transmission and thus the wheels. And through that, the vehicle starts to slow down. Well, in a diesel engine, that option's not always available because you're not going to have this throttle valve, so you can't create a vacuum between it and the cylinder within the intake manifold. So the difference that happens in a diesel engine, there's actually two different methods. For smaller trucks and smaller diesels, what they'll do is they'll put a valve in the exhaust, so that when you are on your exhaust stroke and you're trying to press out that exhaust, you're going to have a valve in your exhaust that's going to start to close much like a throttle valve, and so that's going to create this back pressure within your exhaust, and so that's going to slow down your vehicle because it's trying to push out these gases, building up pressure against this piston, but it cannot because of that valve. So, obviously it allows some to pass through, but it slows your vehicle down. Now, the other method, and the one that's used for larger diesel engines, and it's commonly referred to as a Jake brake, what you'll have happen is during your compression stroke, normally if you leave these valves closed, if you don't open up either your intake or your exhaust valve during your compression stroke, which you wouldn't do, all of that pressure that's built up within there then goes to press that piston down. So you don't really have much energy lost, because though you did have to pressurize that air, that pressurized air then pushes back and continues. So you don't really have a net energy loss, a little bit, but not much. So the thing that you want to do is during that compression stroke, once it gets up to top dead center, you're going to open up the exhaust valve. And so when you open up that exhaust valve, you're going to let that exhaust air out, or that compressed air out, and so it no longer is going to be used in reverse to press that piston down. So you're working to compress the air, and then you're letting that compressed air out. And you work to compress that air, and then you let that compressed air out. And that's why you hear it actually, is that exhaust valve opening and that compressed air coming out, and they can be rather noisy. Of course, the clearance is going to be such that when the exhaust valve opens, it's not going to come into contact with the piston once it comes up close to top dead center. But essentially what you want to do is let that pressurized air out so that you don't have it press the piston back down, and then you don't have much of an energy loss. So that's how diesel engines will engine brake. That's how you'll slow down a vehicle using the engine in a diesel vehicle. And those are some of the major differences between gasoline and diesel engines. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those below. Thanks for watching.